Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Carol Bell. I'm the treasurer of the Society, and it's my huge pleasure today to introduce our speaker. On the grounds that I've been to Easter Island twice in my life, and therefore I'm probably the only council member who's actually been there, not once but twice in my case. So I'm absolutely fascinated by the subject. I know you all know about the Society, so I won't rehearse things, but just to underline that we were founded in 1707, and today we're really focused on our core objectives, which include sharing our collections and our work with the public, which we do through lectures like this one today, and also through tours, exhibitions, and publications. So it's a huge pleasure to introduce today's lecture, Ecocide, What Went Wrong in Rapa Nui, by Mike Pitts FSA. Mike is an archaeologist, writer and broadcaster, and former museum curator and editor of both British Archaeology magazine and the Society's Salon newspaper. He's published in peer-reviewed journals such as Nature, Antiquity, and the Antiquaries Journal, and has written books on topics from Stonehenge to the discovery of Richard III's grave. In the 1990s, he spent over a year among the Pacific Islands, including 1 month in Rapa Nui. His new book, Island at the Edge of the World, The Forgotten History of Easter Island, Bloomsbury 2005, and I'm sure Mike will be waving a copy of it actually later on, reconsiders the island's archaeology and history, exposing the fallibility of widely held assumptions and proposing a new global approach to understanding one of the world's most extraordinary cultural achievements. So without further ado, Mike, please take the floor.
Thank you. I feel a bit of an imposter at the moment, having only been to Rapa Nui once. What I'm talking about is part of what my book is about. This is my book, Island at the Edge of the World. It essentially has 4 stories in it, 4 threads in the book, and this is one of them. I'm going to start with a British ship. Get there. HMS Topaz. In November 1868, it anchored in Valparaiso, a Chilean stopover on voyages spanning the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. The press focused on a visit to Juan Fernandez Island, where officers raised a memorial inscription to Alexander Selkirk, said to be the inspiration for Robinson Crusoe. But in Valparaiso, something else caught everyone's attention. The frigate bore 3 carved figures. One graced the prow, a modest work in wood of a woman with a tiara. The other 2 were stone and wholly unfamiliar in appearance. The larger stood on deck, propped up with capstan bars and its protective shroud removed. The Topaz was in Valparaiso for a little more than 6 months. The statues became minor celebrities. They were too cumbersome to disembark, so people were allowed on board to see them. Among those who came was a photographer from the Helsby Company, which had studios in Chile and Liverpool. He recorded the larger carving in 2 now iconic shots. The Topaz had previously been at Easter Island. This was the first statue from there ever to be photographed. Prints went around the world, and so did stories about the island. It was, said one report, so destitute of wood that it has little to boast of in the way of beautiful scenery. The effect depressed the whole ship's company. For the most part, said another, the island consisted of plains of coarse grass and loose volcanic stones and bare hills without a single stream of any kind. Islanders were no better. The men were lazy, indolent, and dirty. The women squalid and dirty. Consumption and the itch prevail owing to bad feeding, want of air in their little wigwams, and the want of cleanliness due to the scarcity of fresh water. Back in England, HMS Topaz unloaded its statues. They ended up in the British Museum, raised side by side under the front portico. They gazed blankly across London, gathering soot and pigeon droppings. No one realizes at the time, but the Topaz's visit to Rapa Nui unwittingly launched a deeply mistaken narrative about the island and its people. Even now, it dominates public discussion of the statues and their makers. It colors perceptions of early Polynesians and their extraordinary achievements in the wider Pacific. It's time we got this right. Rapa Nui's archaeology is staggering. On this map, each of these little white discs is the site of a stone plinth that supported from 2 to 3, mostly more, to 15 statues. The island's small. Here's Hyde Park to the same scale. I've called my talk What Went Wrong in Rapa Nui. It's part of what my book is about. And the question has two sides. What people have been saying went wrong on the island and what really went wrong. It's an extraordinary story that resonates far beyond a remote corner of the Pacific. It's certainly remote. I spent a month there in 1994. I arrived from Tahiti, flying eastwards 6.5 hours from the center of the South Pacific, crossing 4 time zones. It would have been another 6 hours further east to mainland Chile. Archaeology currently favors Mangareva as home for those who discovered Rapa Nui around 1200 CE. Perhaps 2 or 3 huge double voyaging canoes sailed east and made landfall after a month and a half at sea. And bear in mind, this would have been almost inevitably after many comparable voyages of which no islands were found and the ships returned to home. Think Moana without shape-shifting and with more jeopardy. By the time Europeans arrived, 3 Dutch ships in 1722, there were 5,000 islanders. They lived in villages around the coast, farming fruit, vegetables, and chicken, and harvesting seafood. They'd made nearly 1,000 statues and covered the island with cairns, turning it into a stone monument to Polynesian beliefs and lifeways. It was all Polynesian, but across the Pacific, from Hawaii to New Zealand, in a vast triangle with sides of 7,000 kilometers, there was nothing else like Rapa Nui. To Europeans, it made no sense. How to explain? So many statues, so few people, such a destitute place. This is one of the many ruined plinths, these little white discs, with toppled statues, a site known as Akahanga. An 18th century French explorer said things went wrong after islanders cut down the trees. In the 1960s and 70s, the era of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring and the Club of Rome's Limit to Growth, Bill Malloy, an American archaeologist, turned the idea into a biblical saga. Monument building, said Malloy, took up too much labor. Growing food became a challenge. Tensions broke. Islanders went to war, further damaging food supplies. Starving people resorted to cannibalism. Statues were felled in anger. Quarries suddenly fell silent as tools were dropped in their thousands around hundreds of incomplete figures. Europeans saw but a few survivors on a ravaged island. Supporting evidence was soon found. Pollen samples from the island's 3 swampy lakes collected by John Flenley, then at Hull University, showed the island had once been forested. The trunks of huge, now extinct palm trees seemed ideal for moving statues. Perhaps the resultant deforestation, said Flenley, caused cultural collapse. The idea spread like wildfire. I always like to have Margaret Thatcher in my lectures. Margaret Thatcher, in an extraordinary speech to the United Nations about deforestation and global warming, and I have to say, Margaret Thatcher was the most explicit European leader about the dangers of global warming. But in this speech, she proclaimed, and I quote, the example of the tragedy of Easter Island. Flenley and his colleagues, and his colleague Paul Barn, elaborated the idea in a book, Easter Island, Earth Island. Kevin Costner turned it into a movie. Look at those tree stumps. In 2005, best-selling science writer Jared Diamond gave it a chapter in Collapse. He labeled the destruction ecocide, a word coined for chemical defoliation in the Vietnam War. Penguin recently republished the chapter as a text that, quote, changed the way we think and talk about the living earth. They called it The Last Tree on Easter Island. Nobel Prize winner Joseph Stiglitz compared a US political crisis to Rapa Nui Islanders who destroyed their future. As US TV presenter Forrest Galanti recently told podcaster Joe Rogan's 7 million watchers, everybody died. Archaeologists, meanwhile, fought back, churning out evidence that islanders did not, in fact, eat each other or go to war or destroy their home. The popular narrative, however, remains intact. Astonishingly, a new version has appeared. It accommodates archaeologists' objections by putting collapse not before, but after Europeans arrived. Paul Cooper's Fall of Civilizations podcast has over 100 million downloads. His book has been a bestseller. He says the Dutch sailors brought disease which all but wiped out islanders. And then they suddenly realized that their ancestors and their statues had no power, so they abandoned them and became Christians. In a fit of Puritan iconoclasm, writes Boris Johnson, yes, him, he was on holiday in the Pacific, islanders tore down statues and welcomed Christianity, quote, a new and purer religion. There is zero evidence for this. The whole ecocide argument is a tower of confusion and misunderstanding. A fake story of cultural collapse has become a cultural assault on Polynesian island legacy. This is just a handful of books. There's a long list of academic papers on the same riff, often written by people who are not archaeologists. How did we get here? What actually happened on Rapa Nui? Let's take the islanders' story first. What do we know about the world Polynesians created there? We'll start on the day the first Europeans set eyes on Rapa Nui, Easter Sunday, 1722. Landing happened 5 days later. Yes, the Dutch shot islanders, and no, the Rapa Nui did not have spears. Between 1722 and 1786, 4 European expeditions came to visit. Their records are the closest we can get through real lives to when the island was still owned by those who discovered and made it. Prior events must somehow have led to what was seen in the 18th century. So what was there? We don't see people making do after war, starvation, and ecological disaster. We see thriving communities growing food with the sophistication of Enlightenment Europeans who were experimenting back home with the very techniques they witnessed: crop rotation, mulching, green manuring, and more. The state of the island makes this the more remarkable. The coast was rocky and dangerous, rain unpredictable. There were no rivers or streams. Only later did Europeans realize people were taking fresh water out of the sea from offshore springs. The soils were stony. There were few trees. The largest mammal was a rat, which islanders ate. The visitors' best efforts at fishing caught almost nothing. Used to tropical abundance on Polynesian islands, they were dismayed at Rapa Nui. But what they saw was not islanders' failure, they saw success. Further south than most Polynesian islands, Rapa Nui's climate is less favorable to tropical crops. It's small, dry, and covered in rock. If people were to grow a society there, most of the trees would have to come down. They needed fields, gardens, and homes. Polynesians discovered several small Pacific islands on which the settlers had, before Europeans got there, all died or left. Rapa Nui is a small Polynesian island on which that didn't happen. Europeans saw yams and sweet potatoes growing in a thick, moist loam in regular, unfenced plots. These details from a French survey showed densely packed fields. Banana trees were planted in straight rows, in holes a foot deep to collect and preserve moisture. Mulberry bushes, whose bark was used for cloth, were surrounded with stone walls to keep off the wind. Weeds were burnt so ashes could be spread as fertilizer. Fields of solanum, a leafy plant related to potatoes and tomatoes, were grown in exhausted soils. Crop rotation, improving yield and soil health while discouraging plant diseases. It may be that the solanum plants were dug in as green compost. There seems to be no other obvious reason to grow them on such a scale. Volcanic debris screened soils from the sun, retaining moisture and releasing minerals. People scattered fragments they added to the rock on the ground to what was already there. Europeans had by then only just discovered the benefits of what's known as rock mulching. After great volcanic eruptions in the Canary Islands, Pacific Islanders have been doing it for generations. Informed stewardship allowed islanders to be generous to visiting Europeans. Crews enjoyed chicken, sugarcane, yams, and plantains cooked in earth ovens and much liked. James Cook thought the sweet potatoes the best he had ever tasted, and Cook tasted a lot of sweet potatoes. You can cherry-pick tales of an island looking as if it had suffered a great fire, of land growing nothing but grass, and of sour water that made sailors throw up. These are central to the ecocide theory, but there are many ways of explaining them. Bad husbandry and a failed society cannot be one. What do the visitors say about that society? We see nothing to suggest breakdown or war. Coming from nations and ships with clear hierarchies and orders of command, Europeans crossed the Pacific in a kind of take-me-to-your-leader frame of mind. They struggled to find any in Rapa Nui. Elsewhere in Polynesia, they negotiated with political or religious leaders. But on Rapa Nui, there were no dominating chiefs. Crowds wielding spears and clubs were not uncommon in the Pacific. There was no army ready to defend Rapa Nui, no sign of violence. When the Dutch fired guns, they were met only with stones thrown by fleeing men. These were not communities defined by warfare. And the statues. This is by William Hodges, Cook's official artist. There's no indication that any statues were being carved in the 18th century. Most were indeed fallen. But there's more to the story than that. Some statues were standing. Some of these were inland, where many still stand, but the 18th century records there are extremely vague. The key locations are coastal, which is where statues were hauled out and raised on large platforms in rows. We'll never get a precise figure. My best estimate from the records is of 150 erect statues in the mid-1700s, all around the coast, where the full total had been 400. There is no evidence to say when the other 250 came down. No European saw one fall or being pushed over. Neither can we say if all were ever standing at once. It may be that occasional natural collapse over centuries was part of the scene, just as in other Polynesian islands, commoner wooden carvings would have remained erect only as long as the decaying timber allowed. It may be nonetheless that islanders were carving statues in the 18th century. Europeans appeared and vanished literally overnight. Over 70 years, they spent a total of no more than a week ashore, and few explored inland. If intermittent, even frequent quarrying and carving were happening, what are the chances that any visitors would have seen such work in action? We don't know. All that comes from published 18th century descriptions. The records are in 4 languages. Original documents are scattered around the world. There is no single modern compilation or set of transcriptions. It's not unlikely that even now some manuscripts remain undiscovered. This is a research priority. Meanwhile, what of the archaeology? What do we know from the material record of what happened before Roggeveen found the island, when the great eco-disaster is said to have occurred? There has been much excavation on Rapa Nui. Not all of it matches Tor Heyerdahl's quality. You can say what you like about him, and there's quite a few things to say, but you can't diss the excavation team he put together. There is no evidence for collapse, nor war, nor starvation, nor cannibalism. Archaeologists and ecologists have been furiously testing ecocide claims. Prominent in this quest has been Terry Hunt at the University of Arizona. Here he is recently at Stonehenge. And Carl Lippo at Binghamton University, New York. Others include Mara Mulrooney when she was at the museum in Honolulu and at the University of Auckland. Robert DiNapoli at the University of Oregon. Chris Stevenson at the Virginia Department of Historic Resources, and Valenti Raul at the Botanic Institute of Barcelona. And there are more, and many co-researchers. I list names to give credit, but also to make a point. Seeking evidence for island collapse has been an industry occupying many scholars for 2 decades. My summary of what they found is backed by a large amount of research and data. First up, war. Earlier European visitors documented warfare in many of the larger Polynesian islands and island groups. This is another fabulous William Hodges painting. It shows a couple of war canoes in Tahiti. On one occasion, Cook estimated he saw 160 such canoes, each crewed by 40 rowers and warriors. There were 170 backup craft, bringing the total army to well over 7,000. These are defensive earthworks and palisades in the North Island of New Zealand. Archaeology shows us many such hilltop defenses in Polynesia and elsewhere in the Pacific, in Samoa, for example, Tonga and Fiji, Tahiti and the Marquesas. Heyerdahl investigated fortified villages on Rapa Iti, an island even smaller than Rapa Nui. Now, Rapa Nui has 3 large hills and many smaller peaks where such defensive remains might have been found. There are none. Tanged obsidian pieces are extremely common on the island. There are many in museum collections in Britain. Ecociders make much of obsidian-tipped spears. But there is no record of a spear being thrown at Europeans. A 19th century observer thought the sticks were for fishing. Most of the stones have irregular edges, not a point. Microscopic wear suggests that they had a variety of cutting and piercing uses. Human remains play a big part in this story. They're common on the island. In 1994, I could see them falling out of cairns. There are many in museum collections. Some have already been returned and more will follow. There is a difficult legacy here. For the moment, however, our interest is in what studies have told us about the people. Their remains have been critical for addressing the ecocide theory. In other words, for telling the islanders' story from their perspective. First, there is no evidence for an unusual degree of violence. One study found injury in 2.5% of the bones, mostly to the head. European collectors were partial to skulls, so this is likely to be an exaggerated figure for the skeleton as a whole. Most wounds were healed, and a few held splintered obsidian slivers. One woman seems to have died from being clubbed on the head. This is consistent with interpersonal aggression, not endemic warfare. 3 lead pellets were found embedded in a skull seen here on the right. The man survived being shot with a European gun. Europe never waged war on Rapa Nui. And there's no suggestion of cannibalism. A few cases of identified cut marks have been interpreted, and I think rightly, as symptoms of funerary rituals. What about hunger? Human remains reveal no signs of malnutrition or starvation. As centuries passed, varied and prolific bird life became less so. People ate fewer deep water fish and more shallow water species and shellfish. This could be the result of overfishing, and I think particularly the difficulty of replacing aging canoes. Good timber became scarce, and there was no pandanus on the island, a significant feature that I think has been largely overlooked by archaeologists, as this was the tree that supplied material for ocean-going sails across Polynesia. But people stayed healthy. Indicators of dietary stress in teeth are normal for the Pacific, much lower than in medieval Europe. In one study at Anakena, a key site seen here, where a large monument came to be built that was restored in the 1970s, chemicals in human remains showed that around half of dietary protein came from the land, rats, chicken, and especially plants. Over time, people ate less marine food than was typical among other Pacific Islanders, but they were doing fine. All these imagined threats are supposed to have caused a population collapse. But guess what? It doesn't show up in the material record. It didn't show in modeling of radiocarbon dates and archaeological remains, first looking at the construction of statue plinths around the coast, then in a wider consideration of settlement and ecology. It didn't show in studies of human DNA. There is no population bottleneck in the 1600s, as proposed by ecocide theorists. Only a steady growth from small beginnings leading to stability. All of which begs a big question. If neither ethnography nor archaeology give any reason to suspect a past population crisis, nor starvation, cannibalism, or war, where on earth did the idea come from? Why ecocide? we need to go back to the beginning. Estimates for Rapa Nui's early population differ wildly. Our best insight lies in the 18th century records. Unsurprisingly, they're not great, but neither are they useless. They suggest to me around 5,000 islanders at that time, a significant population, though much less than that proposed by many ecociders. And there's a really interesting study to show that during the course of the development of the ecocide theory over a number of years, the population estimates steadily grew without any particular change in the evidence, which of course made the ecocide theory the more dramatic, as the higher the population was to begin with, the greater the destruction and loss. We start 800 years ago with a colony of perhaps 200 or 300 people, and the rest is extrapolation from those figures and what archaeologists have read from the island's remains. The first European visitors had, without doubt, a big impact on the island world that played out over the following century. What we can see speaks more of islanders' creative empowerment than loss or damage. That is another part of my book, but it's not our concern now. But there are no indications of population decline. Visitors continue to stop for water and supplies. Navy ships seeking wider opportunities for trade and power in the Pacific, or vessels traveling between New England and southern whaling grounds. In a notorious incident in 1805, 22 islanders were kidnapped to work on a seal hunting colony. All of the 12 men dived into the sea and drowned. An islander was shot dead in 1822. Later, a Connecticut whaler was killed by islanders. But the great shock came in the 1860s. The island would never be the same again. Over just 4 months in late 1862 and early 1863, 14 ships kidnapped or killed a total of 1,500 islanders. Details are shocking. 8 ships arrived from Peru. Islanders come out to inspect trinkets scattered as bait. The one-eyed Spanish leader fires his revolver. Sailors copy him, and there is chaos. People run screaming into the sea or behind rocks. At least 10 islanders are accidentally shot dead. Over 200 are tied up and divided between the ships. So that each can claim their rightful share, captives are marked with collars or tattoos like sides of beef. Those that survived the voyage back to Peru, and not all did, are sold to work on plantations or in colonial households. Peru and Chile have recently outlawed slavery. The traders, armed with blunderbusses and cutlasses, in ships fitted with iron gratings and swivel guns, claim to have offered islanders contracts, and then they sell the contracts. But newspapers protest. Missionaries and diplomats across Polynesia alert contacts in North America and Europe. Just 7 months after it had begun, the traffic is banned. Transported islanders are ordered back to sea. In Lima, the main port, there is a severe smallpox epidemic. During the whole of this slavery episode across the Eastern Pacific, over 6,000 Polynesians die. About half perish in Peru or on board ship. The other half are fellow islanders infected by the returnees with smallpox or dysentery. And of all the islands so affected, the highest number of deaths, an estimated 1,000, occurs on Rapa Nui. And this is just the start. The first Christian missionary arrives in 1864, immediately after these slave raids. Already traumatized islanders are baptized, their culture and values suppressed. Just 4 years later, Jean-Baptiste Dutroux-Bornier, this is he, comes to live, fleeing a death sentence for arms trafficking in Peru and gambling debts in Tahiti. He declares himself king and claims to buy land until he controls almost all of Rapa Nui, sending dispossessed islanders to work on plantations in Tahiti. His game is breeding sheep. Rapa Nui has become a ranch. His sketch map shows how little land he allowed islanders, here I've coloured that blue, who he calls Indians. They are rehoused away from their monuments and gardens, rupturing clans and communities. A fragile truce between rival missionaries collapses. Houses are burnt, crops destroyed, women abused, and people shot. Dutroux-Bornier has his own cannon. Missionaries escape with their followers, and hundreds more islanders go to plantations in Tahiti and Mangareva, where half of them soon die. Just 15 years after the first slave ship, the population of Rapa Nui has fallen from 5,000 to 110, a 98% loss. There are just 26 women. But there are plenty of sheep. Animals vastly exceed people. The island is ideally suited to the enterprise. There is already much open grassland, and the global market for wool and mutton is strong. In an uncanny resemblance to the Highland clearances in Scotland, generations of gardens, houses, and monuments lie abandoned and inaccessible as their owners move into the missionary village at Hangaroa, die, or emigrate. To protect stock, islanders are forbidden to leave a walled compound. The ranch goes through several hands until in 1903, a multinational British company, Williamson Balfour, buys the business. The wall is policed until 1966. Today, Hangaroa remains the only settlement on the island. At its peak, the island flock reached 40 or 50,000 head. Monuments were plundered to build walls. Cattle chewed the bark off sacred Toromiro trees, which became extinct. Fires were set across the island to improve grazing. The landscape bore no relationship to anything the Rapa Nui knew before a European contact. And here's the thing. The first scientific expeditions came to the island in the 19th century from Europe, Chile, and North America. They talked to islanders. They measured, drew, and photographed, some excavated, and they collected. HMS Topaz took 2 statues. Other statues went to Santiago, Paris, and Washington, D.C. Bringing together the results of this work is today another research priority. In the 1870s, interest in Easter Island and its mysteries took off. The outside world now had objects and pictures to look at. Among its many wonders, the island had produced its own unique script, engraved on pieces of wood. All surviving 25 pieces were collected at this time. There were human remains to examine too, and there were stories and legends to ponder. Look closely at the chart. These landmark expeditions all came shortly after the slave raids. The island population was devastated by disease and emigration. When it fell to 110, it may have been the lowest ever. The original colonizing canoes likely brought 2 or 3 times that. Communities were broken or wiped out. Elders with cultural and spiritual knowledge had died. Christian values and myths were replacing traditional Rapa Nui customs. The population slowly recovered through local growth and immigration. Other Pacific Islanders brought their own stories and ideas. New mythologies filled the void. here's the complete graph. It's quite straightforward. Population rises steadily from discovery 1200 CE and does not fall as after the arrival of the first 4 European expeditions in the 18th century, but faces a disastrous collapse after a few months of the slave raids and then the introduced diseases in the 1860s. And immediately after that, we get these scientific expeditions, these six expeditions that come from Europe, Chile, and the US. And as you can see, the sheep population rises dramatically, as indeed does the population of cattle. An island. So the first scientific expeditions thought they were recording a remote Polynesian culture. What they actually saw, seemingly unaware of immediate history, with missionaries their only source, was the impact of European avarice and infighting. An island with little vegetation but grass, an island with a tiny population herded into a refugee ghetto, complete with a shelter for sufferers of Hansen's disease or leprosy introduced in 1888. An island covered in monumental ruins that spoke of a lost civilization and much larger communities. And speaking of monumental ruins, those archaeologists in the audience, I think, will empathize with me when you look at something like that and you think, my goodness, what could we do on this island? Because everything in this island is stone. It's like, for those British archaeologists of a certain age, remember Andrew Fleming's work on Dartmoor. It's like that, but squared. Everything that happened on the island happened with stone and is still there. Thus was born the idea that the Rapa Nui had destroyed their home. If archaeology had been able to step in at this point, the narrative might have been quite different. Indeed, an English couple who sailed out to the Pacific and back twice, leaving in 1913 and again in 1920, did the field work and came to the right conclusions. But they were ignored and their research was forgotten. Why that happened is another strand of my book and the subject of another talk. Instead, early Rapa Nui history was built not on archaeology, but from island legends. Here was found the second key element of the ecocide theory: war. This was the province of Father Sebastian Englert, a Franciscan missionary who settled in 1935. He elaborated stories of an ancient battle between two halves of the island. Overpopulation, said the legends, as told by Englert, drove food shortages and cannibalism. Houses were burnt, statues toppled, professional warriors and general anarchy ruled, and culture collapsed. Thankfully, said the priest, this all ended in the 19th century when missionaries arrived. The island was saved by God. In the father's words, acts of cruelty ceased. Englert's storytelling had a profound effect on 20th century ideas about Rapa Nui. He was popular with islanders and visiting Europeans. Thor Heyerdahl, excavating on the island in the 1950s, thought him the greatest personality he'd ever known. Heyerdahl bought into his war story, bending it to a belief that only white people could have created the statues. The war was between South Americans and Polynesians. Heyerdahl used the legends to create and date a three-stage Rapa Nui prehistory. Echoes remain in much modern literature. Many cling on to the notion of an intra-island war. As we saw, Heyerdahl's archaeologist Bill Malloy grew the idea into an ecological catastrophe. And so we return to John Flenley's pollen studies, the third and final exhibit in this ecocide case. Exactly what the island's flora looked like when it was first discovered remains to be detailed. The density of the palm forest and the size of trees, for example, have likely been exaggerated. As I describe in my book, John Dransfield, the very botanist who first identified Flenley's ancient pollen as an extinct form of a rare Chilean wine palm, which grows huge, tall trunks. Dransfield later objected to all the talk of trees cut down to move statues. In his opinion, we really don't know what these Rapa Nui palms look like. They might not even have had straight trunks at all. It may be, as has been in the news again recently, that rats ate palm nuts and killed off all the trees. But they didn't eat all the trees. People cut them down. It's what farmers do. Farmers understand soils. Tree clearance need not mean that islanders destroyed their ecology. On the evidence of archaeology and history, what seems to have happened is that they made the island more productive. They introduced useful plants and animals, cared for soils, met their needs through an understanding of the island's natural resources. They were not ecocidal, they were eco-nurturing. In the best of circumstances, myths are not straight reporting. In Rapa Nui, the real history of the island makes most of them irrelevant to what happened before 1860. It was brutally assaulted by slavery, disease, missionaries, and ranchers. It lost those very experts in traditions, even as they tried to save stories in a script that itself became indecipherable. Island culture revived as the population grew back and people from other Pacific islands, South America, and Europe came to settle. With characteristic resilience, Rapa Nui reinvented itself with a mix of local and imported ideas and traditions. Modern storytelling can imbue contemporary identities. It has its place in emotive engagement, but it cannot help us understand the ancient island. Only archaeology, informed by ethnography, can do that. Archaeology failed Rapa Nui in the 20th century, but it's not too late. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I, for one, will be reading the book in some detail. Could I open up for questions first in the room, please? Over here.
Thank you. That was a fantastic talk. Could you expand a bit on the suggestion that the rocks were used for cultivation?
Rock mulching.
Rock mulching, that's what you call it.
Okay, yeah. The thing about Rapa Nui is that once you clear the natural vegetation, which is an essential prerequisite to growing food, you expose the soils, which are quite fragile. And the island is naturally covered in stone. It's an incredibly difficult thing to walk over. You know, they're just rocks everywhere. But what those rocks do, the small fragments, volcanic fragments do, is that they shield the soils from the sun. And at the same time, rain dissolves minerals and chemicals from the rocks, which improve soil quality. And rock mulching is now used on a semi-industrial scale. It's being developed as a way of returning carbon to the ground, to the earth. And experiments, it's sort of being, rock is literally ground up into a powder and sprayed over fields. And as well as improving crop yields, improving soils, it's also seen as a way of, one of many ways of helping to combat the ecological crisis of global warming. So it's an active thing today. And it was only really discovered by Europeans, as I said, after these great eruptions in the Canary Islands, when somebody noticed incredibly regrowth vegetation very powerfully in the ash and rocks. from the eruptions.
Other questions in the room?
Thank you very much. It brought back memories of working there last year. One thing that dawned on me when I was working there was the problem of the basaltic soils being very granular and therefore not generating minerals that were conducive for making clay. So water management seemed to me to be a big issue, that collecting it, storing it, using clay for making pottery vessels and so on, that whole side seemed to be working against people living there. And so I couldn't see any evidence very much of water management. On the other hand, it does get quite a lot of rain and it instantly goes away and it drains down through these fine-grained granular soils. So the whole rock fabric is with water channels and caves and caverns that pipe the water down to the sea level and and coming out as springs in the ocean.
No, that is a very good question, and it's not one that archaeologists have yet really been able to answer with substantial evidence. There's plenty of theory. As you say, what happens when it rains, most of the water just soaks straight into the rock, which is how we get these springs, fresh springs occurring off the shore, because the water goes down into the water table, which crops out just offshore. There's no pottery on the island, so they're not making pots. They can carve wooden vessels and so on. And there are quite a common feature on the island, a sort of dished scoops in natural rock. And one suggestion is that those were there to hold water from rain, but not in sufficient quantities to use in agriculture. So I think things like, we see these pits dug around banana trees and use of walls and arrangements of crops that actually they're going to be creating through sophisticated land management. They're going to be creating microclimates around their own crops. And it's notable, I think, that significant that almost all the major activity, the statues and the settlements, are very close to the coast. And that could well be because that is where they're getting fresh water, which they need to carry inland. But exactly how they were doing this, I think, is something that remains to be researched. But the bottom line is they must have succeeded. So I was trying to sort of show that the 18th century records, particularly the French expedition, which took a gardener with them, so somebody who really understood soils and farming and growing, was specifically on the expedition to advise on the potential of the island and other places they were going to visit for future agriculture. And he gives some really good descriptions of how the islanders are managing their soils and landscape, and clearly they knew what they were doing.
Thank you for your wonderful talk, and the illustrations, I think, are lovely.
Well,
beautiful empty island, it
I have
seems.
thousands of photographs.
However, your population graph suggests there might be 6,000 people there, if I'm understanding it correctly. And I'm wondering where they all live, and in what do they live? What is their habitation?
The graph was supposed to show 5,000, but I mean, the estimates are very difficult. But actually, a popular estimate that's been going around amongst archaeologists is lower than that, is 3,000. I think 5,000 is more realistic. But in the past couple of decades, estimates have risen vastly above that. I mean, 20,000 or even more, particularly favoured by proponents of the ecocide theory. So we're, to a great extent, we're guessing. But the island is absolutely covered in houses and fields, settlements, as well as these religious ritual monuments, which are also just everywhere. So I think 5,000 is not a difficult population to accommodate. I mean, the current population, for example, is 7,000 or 8,000, and almost to a person, they live in this one settlement, Hangaroa, on one side of the island.
Thank you. Take one more in the room and then we'll go online.
Sir, thank you very much for your lecture. It was really fascinating. I am struck by how you closed it, basically saying how archaeology has failed Rapa Nui. And I'm just curious if you can say a little more about how some of these scholars, who I'm sure are serious in their own right, have practiced, I suppose, archaeological malfeasance to really distort the record. I mean, archaeology is sometimes not the most scientific in terms of let's just, using numbers and things. It has some conjecture, but it seems like the conjectures in this case have been wildly distorted for quite a long period of time. Thank you.
Of course, I'm being deliberately dramatic when I say archaeology failed Rapa Nui, because there has been some great archaeology done. I mean, Tor Heyerdahl's team did some really good and well-recorded excavations, and there's been a lot of good archaeology done, not least by the names that I listed in my talk. But there has also been a lot of pretty poor quality stuff. There was some great archaeology done at the beginning in that expedition. I mentioned the English couple did some, well, perhaps the archaeology wasn't brilliant, but they did a lot of good surveys and collected a lot of really, really important oral information. All that was lost. And their excavations, for which there are records, are a terrible mess, the records, but there are records. They excavated a large number of statues at the quarries. And those excavations have never been properly examined by modern archaeologists, and I'm absolutely convinced there will be valuable information there. The problem for archaeology in Rapa Nui is that it is if it's not remote today, it's expensive. To get there is a logistic exercise that costs a lot of money. And so to mount the sort of excavation project we might do in Britain is horrendously expensive and has never really occurred. I mean, even Tor Heyerdahl's project never reached the sort of scale that is fairly typical of an excavation project in Britain today. And to mount that on Rapa Nui is a huge challenge. And it's certainly not something that could be done locally. So it would need to be an international project, obviously led and co-directed by people on the island who come first. But it's the sheer logistic challenges and the expenses of mounting modern large-scale excavations on the island have always been there and have I think, led to projects that were not sufficiently ambitious, were not sufficiently large scale, were not sufficiently published or analyzed, not sufficiently critiqued over the past century or so. And it's a story, in a sense, you could tell of any, you can tell that story of Britain, for example. There's been a lot of really terrible archaeology happened in Britain. But I think, like so many things on Rapa Nui, this happens there at an exaggerated sort of technicolor scale.
Very good. Let's, anything online?
Yes, we've had a few comments online and a question about the ecological impact of the island's population, of the Polynesians on the island, for example, with the quarrying of the stone, and what was their impact on the environment?
I think there are two things happening there. The first is that they are farmers. You know, the Polynesians are farmers. They're, if you like, they're Neolithic farmers. They're stone-using farmers. They've been farming with the sort of plants that they bring with them because there aren't any natural domestic food plants on the island. So everything is brought with them, the bananas, the plantains, taro, and so on. They've been farming these plants for millennia. They know exactly what they're doing. They've been living on Pacific islands for millennia. They understand the climate and the soils and rock and so on. They understand the sea even better. So when they find Rapa Nui, I think one of the first things they would do is think, this isn't a great place. You know, they would see immediately that there are challenges there, that the small size of the island means the ecology is restricted compared to many of the places that they know. That there isn't the range of plants and the range of animals and wild animals and so on that they're used to seeing. But they have to cut down trees, they need to grow food. Now, in the process of doing that, they're actually improving, from a human perspective, they're improving the productive capacity of the island. They're introducing domesticated foods and they are growing them. And to do that, they are looking after soils. To make that sustainable, they're looking after soils. And over time, that becomes more of a challenge, but they find ways of overcoming those challenges. At the quarry, it's a great rock outcrop, volcanic outcrop. It's almost, I feel, it must have tempted people to make the statues. It's a very unusual geological formation in terms of its size, and particularly the rock it's composed of, which is really soft. And I think it might almost have been easier to carve a statue out of stone in that quarry than it would have been out of hard wood. And it's a problem today on the island. The rock is eroding very badly. The statues are washing away, almost literally dissolving in rain. So the statue quarry is very concentrated. It's just in one place. There's this one outcrop of, and there's no way, because it has very steep rock faces, nobody could ever have grown anything on that rock outcrop. So so the actual process of carving and quarrying the statues would have done absolutely no ecological damage at all. And the extent to which statue moving across the island led them to cutting down more trees than they would otherwise have done, I think it's very debatable, because they're cutting down trees anyway for various reasons. Over the centuries, the forest, such as it might have been, is gradually receding, and by the time Europeans arrive, there's very little of it left. And the same thing is going to be affecting them as far as their statues go. They're moving these statues, however they do it, and I don't think they walk them, incidentally. If you've seen this in the news, I really don't think that's how they did it. I think they would have made sledges and dragged them across the ground. They need timber of some kind or another. And over the centuries, as the forest disappears, then they're able to drag out fewer and fewer statues. And I think this would be part of the process. At the beginning, once they get the idea of carving stone statues, they're doing that first at the quarry, then later they start dragging them out onto the coast to raise on plinths. And then gradually, over time, they fall down on the plinths, they take out more statues. But as this process is happening, the number of trees on the island is gradually shrinking back. And so their ability to move statues out from the quarries gradually falls off. So I think there's this kind of rise in statue carving and taking out to the coast and then gradually declining again, at which point a European started arriving.
Very good. Well, we're at the top of the hour. I'm sure we could go on for much, much longer. But before I thank you again, Mike, I just would like to announce that the next lecture is on Tuesday, the 27th of January at 1 o'clock. And it'll be on queering the British holiday, which is a different thing altogether from queering it, by Matthew Roberts. And of course, our full event program is on our website, and bookings are open. So it remains for me to thank Mike very much indeed for his lecture, the number of questions, the testimony, how interesting we all found it. And one last thing for me, I suddenly remembered when you showed Jared Diamond's book, I met him there when he was researching it.
Did you?
I did. So that's another story.
Did you tell him off?
Yeah.
Did you tell him off?
I told him off about oversimplification on the Bronze Age collapse, which I was writing a PhD on at the time. But anyway, thank you all very much. And I'm sure Mike will take some questions after we close proceedings formally. Thank you very much.